Welcome to another episode of Come Together. And we're live. Dennis, I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining
Thank you.
today.
I'm pleased to
Um,
be here.
so I came across your work a couple of years ago. I've started getting into the Grateful Dead. I actually found them by way of Joe Russo's Almost Dead, if you're familiar with them.
I am.
And they covered a song called Atlantic City that Springsteen wrote, and the band covered it too.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of, so I heard the jammed out version of that song, and then I, started listening to more of the music, and then I came across this whole world and culture that I was just absolutely blown away by, and it's kind of really had a huge influence on my life ever since then. And your book about the Grateful Dead, A Long Strange Trip, was like my roadmap and biography to like really understanding or starting to understand the culture and get a feel for the main characters, the environment. And it was like, I mean, I felt like I was reading a textbook about the coolest stuff that I love to, I love to read and love to learn about. And, and then you said, and then when I sent you an email, you mentioned that you just wrote another book, which I have over here also, The Last Great Dream, and that blew me away. That blew me away just as much. So thank you first of all for the amazing work. I would love to talk about all this stuff with you. How did you come across writing I know you have two more books, but how did you come across writing these epics? And what are the other books about?
I was in graduate school and I was looking for a dissertation topic. And let me start all over again. So I was in graduate school and I had spent the summer in France to try and fake my way through a language examination, which I managed to do. Um, so as a result, I stayed in a dormitory. And let me advise all people who might not be in that situation. You don't want to live in a dormitory in graduate school. The kind of people that want to live in dormitories in graduate school after 4 years of college are not the kind of people you mostly want to hang out with. But never mind. So there was this one guy. He was the only dope smoker in the building, and he was very kind, and he shared his weed with me because I had zero money and nothing else. And one night we were talking, and I said something about, yeah, I'm thinking about a dissertation topic, and maybe I'll do the beats. That would be interesting. And he said, um, you should do Kerouac. His papers are at Columbia, and you can stay with my friends in the Bronx. Now, having a place to stay in New York City on the subway is right away, incredible. I was truly broke, like most graduate students. And the people who were in that apartment that I stayed with, as a matter of fact, are still some of my closest friends. And this was 1972. So
Good
we're
year.
more than 50. That's the year you were born, right?
Yeah, sure. It was the year of all
Yeah.
the year that my music taste was born.
So anyway, uh, I started working on Kerouac, and of course, he was a raving deadhead. And as I went along, I realized the connections. Most obviously, that Dean Moriarty of On the Road was Neil Cassidy of the famous Grateful Dead song "Cowboy Neil at the Wheel of the Bus to Never Ever Land."
Mm.
And so I said, okay, I want to do these two books. And long story short, I eventually finished the Kerouac book, sent it to Jerry and Hunter at the Grateful Dead fan club post office box. I had absolutely no idea how to get a hold of them. Um, and I also intuitively knew that if I marched up to the Grateful Dead and said, "Hi, I'd like to write a book about you," they'd tell me to take a number. So I just sort of kept my mouth shut. Eventually, I met Jerry and mentioned the Kerouac book. Yeah, I'll take it from there. Uh, so as I say, I wanted to write a book about the Grateful Dead, and I sent a copy to Jerry, at the Grateful Dead fan club address, which was all I knew. Um, and eventually I met Jerry and mentioned the Kerouac book. And it turned out that, in fact, Kerouac and On the Road in particular were his Bible. It was just one of the building blocks of his entire persona. Um, he had this is a story that's actually in The Last Great Dream because it's kind of pivotal, and that is the transmission of culture. So you have the Beats in the 50s, and one of them was a guy named Wally Hedrick who taught art at the Art Institute and taught classes on Saturdays to high school kids. And Jerry was one of them. And among other things, he played acoustic blues while they painted. And this resulted that summer in when Jerry got a accordion for his birthday. He pissed and moaned and cried and told his mother it had to be a guitar. And eventually it was a guitar, which kind of settled his life. That was it for the next 40 years or whatever it was. Uh, and it was also about the beats. They asked him about. Wally Hedrick was a very well known beat painter. And they said, what is this beat thing? And Wally said, you guys are beat. Go down to City Hall, to City Lights bookstore, and get this book On the Road, which was, of course, a bestseller at the moment. And Jerry did. It was the one question I never asked him was, did you buy it or did you take it? I suspect the latter, but you never know. I didn't ask. It was my omission.
Right.
So anyway, long story short, I began working on a Grateful Dead book, and I researched that for about 3 years, which was hugely fun. I love research, and the publicist needed to go away for his health and did, and the receptionist at a company meeting, said, "What are we going to do about publicity?" And Jerry said, "Get McNally to do it. He knows that shit." So I did, and I became the Dead's publicist for umpteen
Wow.
years. And then eventually Jerry died. I wrote the book, finished the book. It took 20 years because I had to put it aside while I was the publicist. Uh, and wrote another book called On Highway 61, which is the sort of the deeper background of all this. And it was basically the relationship of white people to black music really since
Mm,
the middle of the 19th century and going up to Dylan.
right.
So um, and then I sort of stopped for any number of reasons. And then in 2016, which was, of course, a year before 2017, um, which is to say the 50th anniversary of the Summer of Love, which was in 1967, so called. I was asked to curate a photo show about that, and I found pictures and started with the beats up to the Summer of Love, and uh, the end result was after about a month or two, I suddenly went, "This is a book." And it takes me a while sometimes. I'm not the sharpest blade. And uh, I started, and that became The Last Great Dream, which is
Wow.
basically the origins of where the people who were in the hate in 1966, really, before it became famous, um, where they came from and where their values came from. And that basically involved the avant-garde art community of San Francisco, the Art Institute, Wally, certainly a fundamental part of it. Um, uh, Electronic composers, theater people, poets, painters, you name it. And they all contributed something, and it's a wonderful story. And then eventually it all sort of combines into a community in the hate, and Shazam. And then if you those people included a whole bunch of folk musicians. Folk music was an essential part of all this. And so you have all these folk musicians like Garcia, but also like Paul Kantner and David Freiberg,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the bands that would be, all the guys in Big Brother. And what would happen was that they encountered two things. So you have all these people, and they've got these unusual in the American context values, whether they even consciously think about it or not. And they're all involved with a community and with basically the idea of a peaceful, gentle community. And then they encounter two things that are very important. They encounter LSD and the Beatles. And after a while, after a very little while, they are playing rock and roll instead of folk music, um, and that's the hate.
Yeah, yeah. What I thought was really cool about the latest book was all the references that you made to the Eastern culture's impact on San Francisco. And I've only, in the last couple of months, actually ever since really reading your book, I've only noticed the impact of geography on culture, and I've only
Oh yeah,
recently become aware of that. And and then now everywhere I look, I can't not see it. I mean, all
yeah,
the conflicts in the world and everywhere you look, everything has to do with just where everyone's situated and the conflicting cultures that, that the fights seem to happen in these little meeting points where everyone seems to, I guess, converge together, Um, and
place.
yes.
It's called place. Usually, when scholars study this, they refer to it as place, um, and it's true. Place, not to get too mystical, because for starters, I'm not really, but uh, you think a certain way to some extent from where you come from. Now, there's lots of variations in all this. Um, you know, I have a taste for Southern food because my mother cooked it a lot. She was from
Hmm.
Chicago. It's a whole long story. But the fact is that, so it isn't just one to one. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. But the fact is that the place has an impact on how you live, how you speak, how you think, what you think. Um,
Hmm.
San Francisco is a particularly distinct version of all that for the simple reason that most cities, most places that have a lot of people, which is to say cities, um, don't. Pardon me. They arise for really basic economic reasons. Denver is where it is because the railroads crossed there, uh, etc. Chicago. I mean, New York City. Had a harbor. Um, and it's usually the values are tended to be bourgeois, middle class, business values, capitalism. San
Right.
Francisco did not get established that way. San Francisco was created by failures, by people who did not fit in on the East Coast. A lot of second sons, where the first son would take over the business, and the second son was like, "What about me?" And a lot of them, um, along with people from Chile and China, took off for San Francisco to hunt for gold. Their values were not bourgeois values. It was crazy time, and
Hmm.
the city eventually became a moderately conventional American city, but it always had a certain amount of room for craziness, for tolerance for craziness that most American cities simply didn't have. And it's literally on to quote Robert Duncan, one of the poets that I talk about, the western edge of dreams. It is literally,
Yeah.
if you envision Western culture starting in Greece and Rome and expanding through Europe, um, and then everybody getting on boats and going to America, and that, okay, expands across America. And then it gets to San Francisco and it stops. Because there's an ocean. And the people in San Francisco were a long way from New York. And in many ways, the artists did not look back to New York. If you were a painter, well, if you were a painter, you looked to New York because that was Jackson, where the sort of the impressionists were. But the fact is that in addition to the fact that literally we were just here on a hill overlooking the Pacific Ocean,
Hmm.
looking toward China and Japan, um, we also had a significant population from China, so you didn't have to go very far. And any number of these artists will tell you that, particularly the composers, a guy named Lou Harrison grew up near Chinatown, and he would hear Chinese music, which is based on a completely
Hmm.
different tone scale from Western music, and he integrated them and sort of integrated gamelan, which is what he ended up loving the most, gamelan with Western music. Um, so there's this mushing together going on,
Yeah.
and San Francisco had institutions by the after World War II that preserved that. The most obvious was one called the Academy for Asian Studies, AAS. Um,
Hmm.
and it was remarkable, and it brought together all kinds of, again, poets, mystics, artists, you name it. Um, and they studied Asian culture, and they, among other things, Alan Watts was the chancellor, and eventually he would have a show about Zen on KPFA, another uniquely San Francisco sort of
Hmm.
plug in into a world culture, into an activist culture, and at a time when in the 50s when people just didn't stray from the straight and narrow. It was a very conformist era. San Francisco wasn't, and particularly the AAAS. So you have Alan Watts on the radio once a week telling people about Zen, and you weren't getting that in New York. And you know this is where San Francisco's culture diverged among as I say, going all the way back to their founding, but in particular, as far as Asia goes, and Asian thought, um, you could start with Watts and with the Academy of Asian Studies.
Yeah, certainly. I thought it's so cool, and it's so funny because when I grew up, and I say this, I've noticed it a lot recently. My education was primarily. I thought America was the only country in the on the map, and I thought that the only history was just American history for 250 years. I never expected that anything else existed, and now I'm learning about all this other stuff, and it's and it almost feels criminal that we're not being taught about all this other stuff because all our roots, the more you learn, the more you see that where our roots came from and where the foundations of being an American, in a lot of different contexts, where they come from somewhere, and these philosophies are not born overnight, and I thought it was just so wonderful that like education is like part of what the culture is taking your education into your own hands, and as opposed to just subscribing to someone else's education. I thought that was so remarkable and so influential. I think that's why the movement is still so strong, because it
And
speaks
that's
so
that's
strongly to people.
exactly what the people in the Haight did. The basic, the fundamentals of the mainstream American culture are American exceptionalism, which is to say that, really only America counts, which is, it's gotten that bad. And in fact, our current administration, that is exactly what they think. And they say it out loud, which is
America first
embarrassing.
is the thing, right?
There you go. Uh, American exceptionalism, implicit, which it leads to an implicit racism, starting with the Constitution, in which black people got three-fifths of a vote. They couldn't use it, but their Southern overseers were able to use it to maintain power. consumerism, uh, the
Mm-hmm.
basic the basic principle of freedom in America. There's two kinds of that. There's one that is the freedom to make as much money as possible, which the current administration waves the flag for, and the freedom of thought to evaluate anything, make jokes about it, or simply um, challenge it. Thoreau being the most wonderful example. I mean, he started and just challenged everything that Christian, a vague Christianity, though in fact, at this point, that's only a tiny fraction of the country, uh, and on and on and on and on, and all these things um, sort of got left behind um, by the 1960s in San Francisco.
Yeah, and I think it's good. I think that lit a flame that hasn't really gone out, and I think that even till
The,
today, you see just the rise of an individual like Billy Strings, where he takes these grassroots and these I'm sorry, bluegrass roots, and combines it with acoustic music, and I think that. I mean, I know that Jerry Garcia did a bunch of albums with David Grisman that was kind of similar, but Billy Strings playing is so unique, and
Billy,
there's like a whole audience that's just chasing after it, and there's a whole world of just people that really live and breathe this kind of stuff, and it's I think it's beautiful.
Bluegrass is a fascinating phenomenon, and Billy Strings is one of the more fascinating aspects of it. His chops are simply. I was talking with Jorma Kaukonen once, and I this was some years back, and I had just heard about Billy Strings and was listening to him, going, "Wow, kid's good." And I was talking with Jorma, and Jorma has a very dry and wonderful sense of humor. And I said, we were talking about something completely different. And I said, by the way, have you heard about this kid? Knowing you've heard about this kid, Billy Strings. And he went, yep, yep. He said, don't like really talking about him. And he just sort of looks me in the eye and gives me almost the wink and says, hate talking about people who can do things I can't. And he was, of course, joking, but no, Billy is he's got chops from God, and that's all I can say. Um, but all that, well, bluegrass is very interesting, among other things, because it is not folk music. It is a profession. It was created by professional musicians. It's really challenging. Um, it is uh, really engaging, so that the best thing about bluegrass, one of the best things, is that at a bluegrass concert, um, the action in the parking lot before and after the show
Hmm.
are, with I mean, half the audience plays some, to some extent, and they're all sitting out in the parking lot, or whatever, picking before they come in to hear, the star. And so there's an engagement there and a community there that's really quite wonderful.
Yeah, what I think is cool, and I'm curious what you think of this. Um, I think that we're seeing a lot of explosion of alternative, we'll call it, thought in today's world, and I think that a lot of I think, and I was talking to a couple of friends about why that might be, and one of the things that someone pointed out to me was, whenever people feel oppressed or squished or like suffocated, it lights something incredibly creative inside ourselves, and that's why like the best poetry I ever wrote was after a heartbreak, or when I felt lost and I didn't know which direction I was going to go in my life or something like that. And he said, "You have," and he goes, say what you will about anything with COVID. It was 3 years of people being miserable, essentially, right? It was really, and justified, not justified, regardless. It was years of people felt isolated, lost, unsure what to do, and everywhere that you look felt everything felt insecure. And I think that since then, there's been like, I mean, John Mayer joined again, joined Dead and Co. And, and the way that the sphere allows this kind of creative level, or the amount of music festivals. I don't know whether, I haven't been following the scene enough to really know whether it's more than pre-COVID or not, but it feels like there's more of an embracing of, the same free spirit that was alive in the 60s and 70s that's happening today.
Well,
And I'm wondering if you think
you
that has to
froze.
do with just, I think that people feel, you know, lost or hurt or broke down a little bit. What do you think?
Uh, COVID and
My
what,
my question is, do
it,
you think that the explosion in creativity today is due to the feeling of people feeling lost and not knowing which direction to turn and a general disenchantment?
I think that's partly true. I think there are a lot of reasons why people feel the way they do. I mean, the more aware of us are aware that our climate is going belly up, and and we've got a maniac who's not doing anything about it in the White House, um, and so that doesn't help either. But really, all of this is part of a a path um, that goes back into the 19th century, and is certainly many of those issues, popped up bigly, sorry, um, in the 60s. And, I occasionally teach a class to high school kids about the 60s. They're taking a class in the 60s, and I go in and talk about stuff. And, uh, and I look at them and I say, look, you guys are interested in something that happened more than 50 years before you were born. If I did that, I'd be looking at the year 1900, and I don't think I'd find anything really great, fantastic to study in 1900. Um, the way you guys are interested in the 60s. The reason I say that you're interested in the 60s is because it hasn't gone away. All these
Hmm.
issues are just as significant as ever. The hippie thing did not affect American politics, unfortunately, much. Maybe it helped end the war, but it did affect American culture. So that if you eat organic food, if you are concerned about the environment, if you do yoga, if you pay attention to Asian thought, if you want gender nonconformity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If all these issues, uh, everything, in other words, that Donald Trump is against, um, uh, you know, then you're affected by the '60s. Um, Let me point out one, sort of significant um, unintended consequence of the '60s, which was in 1966, Ronald Reagan got elected governor of California by
Hmm.
running against the free speech movement, the Haight-Ashbury, and Watts, the Watts Rebellion. Um, in other words, the same, and then he got elected president on the same platform. And there's a straight through line from Reagan to Trump, in which basically white males are protecting their long old privileges, um, and are terrified of losing them. And that's what's going on. We made progress in with feminism, and with against racism, and with gay marriage, for instance, being really calmly accepted.
Yeah.
And now we got a Supreme Court that might reverse it. Who knows? I mean, it's a grim situation. But all of this is a reaction to the '60s. Um, I mean, that's what Trump is about. And you can just
I think it's been everyone. It almost feels like it's anyone in the straight world. I mean, if you just look at the trajectory of people that are in positions of authority, and then the way that they treat regular people that ask questions, that say anything, or that try to mind their own business or do their own thing, it almost feels like individualism is a threat. That's what it feels like. That's been the case. I don't like. I mean, I'm sure the administration and politics have to do plenty with it, and I think that there is more than a fair. I think that there's been a direct trajectory for the last 30 years of you know everyone in office just trying to impose authoritarianism on the American people. It feel, but yeah, I think your point about the fact that everything is still a response to the '60s is correct, and I think that that's because they really tapped into something that was really, really free and beautiful, and really magnificent, and I think I think it's threatening to order. It's why LSD is banned. I mean, it's why it's considered a dangerous drug to people that don't know anything about it.
Yeah, the irony, of course, with LSD is that its use and spread in the 50s was controlled by the CIA. And I might
Right.
add, this is not conspiracy theory. This is history.
Yeah.
They encountered it and they decided that they might be able to make it use it as a truth serum, which
Mm-hmm.
after a whole lot of experimenting, they were wrong. But so what else is new? Uh,
Right.
and but the fact is that yes, all this is true. Freedom always scares certain aspects of the social order. Um, in the '60s, things felt really unhinged. Now more than ever, the same.
Mm-hmm.
So there you go.
Yeah. So tell me about, I have to hear about what it was like living in San Francisco with the Dead as their publicist. And I want to hear about, and I want to hear about the research and how you do research in the book, for your books. Your books are encyclopedias. Your books are like, they're like it's not even that there's so much information in them. It's so easy to track down the information that you're presenting too. So like, if I don't know anything about jazz music in New York, you give me enough information that it's so easy to just put in a name and a date and a location in Google and get a book about it in a minute. And so I appreciate that. First of all, thank you.
You're
What's it like
welcome.
living with it?
It's not me. Thanks, Sergey Brin. Google. I I am not young, and I get I grew up in the '60s thinking, hope I die before I get old. Well, maybe not that, but God, do I really want to sound like my father again? Um, but it's beyond astonishing. Um, Let me give you an example. So I started working on my Kerouac book in 1972. Um, the closest thing to the internet was the New York City phone book. I mean, there was, um, I you just bump into things when you research. You bump into things. You read the first. Oh, I should know about that book. Okay, I'll read it. Check the footnotes. Maybe it'll send me to other books. Maybe it won't. Um, and you go, and it goes on. It's kind of mysterious. And eventually you start building you have an idea of where you're going, and maybe toward the end you're actually okay. I need to know this, and I need. Um, uh, in 1972, you went to you got information by going to the library, and those lovely librarians, librarians, would show you where to go, um, and and when you track down people, here's one example of the difference of research. Um, there's a very, very important person in Jack Kerouac's life by the name of Gilbert Milstein, who was an editor in the 50s. He was an editor at the New York Times, who review it accidentally got the assignment because the main guy was on vacation, got the assignment to review on the road, and gave it, you know, a well, a review that made it a bestseller and also killed Kerouac because fame was not really something he was emotionally ready to handle. Um, and I found him by watching television, and he in 1974 or 5, whenever I found him. He was working for ABC News, and I happened to read the credits one night, and there was Gilbert Milstein. I said, it has to be the same guy. So I just picked up the phone the next day and called ABC News and got to him pretty quickly. And then went down and interviewed him. And, I was the first person to really, get to him. I was only the second biographer of Kerouac. So, these were very early days. Uh, Now, today, 2025, a woman who's a friend of mine named Holly George Warren is doing a new biography of Kerouac, um, where she's been commissioned by the estate, and she has access to a million things I never did. And we were talking, and I was teasing her, and I was saying, well, you can do all your research, virtually all your research from home, you know, even when you find stuff at a library, half the time, if you write the librarian, they'll probably copy it and send it to you. I mean, and on and on and on and on. And she went, yeah, and you got to hang out with all the people that knew him that are all gone now that I talk to. Good point. So the point is, the evolution of research is in our life, in my lifetime, not yours. Um, it's phenomenal. And literally, the what the approach that I took in '72 is I joked that I read his mail, which is to say I went to every university archives I could find. It wasn't just at Columbia. Uh, I interviewed everyone that I could find, which was most of the people that were important in his life. Um, and I also sort of set a baseline of American culture by going through Life magazine during his lifetime, which is a lot of
Mhm.
magazines.
Yeah.
Because I did it on the premise that if it made it into Life magazine, of it, some issue, some personality, some whatever, um, then almost everybody knew about it, or at least it
Hmm.
represented the consensus. Um, and because again, I'm not from the literary department. I'm a historian, and which is why they're so stuffed. Because I mean I'm pretty serious about the history of it, uh, and I wanted to reveal Kerouac. Was a diarist. I mean he wrote fiction, but he wrote fiction that was based on his life and what he
Hmm.
observed, which is true of every novelist, but in his case, it was closer to day to day than others. And he, um, this reveals there's a principle that if you can tell the story of one person with enough detail, if you've got enough research, you can tell the story of the times. That
Right.
what we all experience is what's going on all around us. And it's, he lived through World War II. He served as a merchant seaman,
Hmm.
Uh, clearly, he hung out with Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder was banned. Gary Snyder was a poet who had been a labor union member, and um, had been, earning his living by spending the summer working as a fire watch in the Pacific Northwest. And after a couple of years, he was not retained because of security concerns. That is, he was banned because he had been a union member.
Oh,
Didn't
wow.
know about that, did you?
No.
And that's the America that Jack Kerouac lived in. Now, Jack
Yeah.
Kerouac, in fact, was very politically conservative, and this did not disturb him as much as it should have, but that's a whole nother issue.
Right. 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 And in terms of so you approach writing like as a historian, not as a novelist.
Precisely.
Um, right. And but you have what I do notice is you put in a lot of fun detail. Like you could tell you put in your own commentary into some of this in some of the stories. that you can tell is in great humor and spirits. One of my favorite stories that I remember, I even remember when I read this book at this point of the story. I was 2 weeks after I got married, and I was in Orlando, and my apartment that my wife and I were supposed to move to had fallen through, and we didn't have a place to live, and this was 2 weeks after we got married. And I'm thinking, I'm going to be this adventurous hippie, and my wife has plans for, otherwise. And so I'm reading this book, and she keeps me grounded. It's great. And I'm reading about the story of Bob Weir drops the water balloon on the cop's head. Um, and and then he couldn't help himself but walk out in the street, while the cop is still looking for the guy that did it, and saying and just said innocently, "Good morning, officer." And I just remember that the way that you phrased it, there was so much, like, I laughed out loud reading it, and I tried to convey to my wife what was so funny at the time. But I obviously, it fails to do justice whenever you try to retell these stories. But we how,
The point is that being a historian is nothing more nor less than being a storyteller. You're trying to tell a story, and you have to make it interesting. One of the problems with much academic history is they don't have that principle. They want to expound. They want to theorize, and frequently they want to connect what's going on to a greater cultural overview, which that's sort of post-Marxist, post-feminist, post this and that. Um, and my argument is, you write history from the facts out, not from a theory in. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm very old-fashioned and have you know, no particular connection with the academic world, um, because I that's why I bailed. As soon as I got my doctorate, I ran to ran screaming from the world of academia. Uh, as you say, I include a lot of the details are what keep people's interest. Um, as I say, and it's there's it's dense. I use that in a positive sense. That my material, there's a lot of stuff stuffed in. Um, as I say, then the job is to make it readable, and on my good days, I do.
Yeah, and they're rereadable is what I've noticed, because as I learn more about that world, and then I go revisit the books, names, dates, and events start becoming more familiar. And for example, the first time reading it, and my favorite songs are China Cat, Sunflower, I Know You Rider, and then 6 months, and then 6 months later, or a year later, I've listened to a dozen more concerts and read a little bit more and listened to some interviews, and then I go back and I'm like, oh my gosh, all these gems over here that I totally missed out on.
As you say, it's a big story, both of the books that we're talking about, and as a result, remember you have a computer in your hand, so although I did put a glossary in with the new book because there were so many names, and I wanted to identify so people could do it quick before they gave up and went to Google. Um, but uh, that's the way things are. I mean, they're very dense. We have mental filters uh, to screen news or the stuff that we don't want to know about. I
Mm-hmm.
literally, I look at every morning. I look at the headlines on my newspaper. I read about one story in 20, and it's not usually the most important story. I mean, why do I want to know more about what rationalizations some political figure has about what they're doing? I can pretty well guess what they are, and learning more is not going to profit me. Besides, I just don't have any room in my brain for it. So, we all do this. We all screen the information. Do I really want to know about a sports team that I don't follow? No. So,
Yeah.
that's fair. That's fair for everybody. So I pick up my information from bits and pieces here and there, and the New York Times, and even then, I get halfway through the article, figure I have the gist, and move on. But that's what we all need to do in order to just function. We live in a world of, just insane information overload, uh, and you have to pay attention in a kind of a self-protective way.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. I think it's and I think that the other thing is also familiarity. I think that when something becomes familiar, you become a little bit more inclined to pay attention to it, and for example, I've just started listening, getting into the jazz world or the jazz history a little bit. And so the details that you mentioned in the beginning of your book, of or I guess towards the I guess middle-ish of the newest book, revolves largely around that scene. And I'm looking for names that I'm familiar with, and then sometimes I find them, and sometimes I don't. And I have to almost force myself to not just jump ahead and skip, and then I have to make it look familiar, seem familiar. Maybe look them up a little bit, or look up what people say about it. And then when I go back to it, I'm like, oh, okay, now I have a bigger context that I think that I'm able to kind of piece everything more together.
And
But
from what you're talking about is everybody's education. I mean, that's exactly what you're going through. Um, I will say that it's much easier now. I mean, in 1967, I left high school, went to college, and there was a guy with a jazz show. I had already gotten into jazz. The first album I ever bought was Thelonious Monk's Live at the Five Spot in a tank town in Dexter called Dexter, Maine, in which there was a candy store, and they had one shelf of records, but they also had the Schwann catalog. I don't. You probably never heard of that. I don't even know. I doubt it exists anymore. The Schwann catalog was the equivalent of the internet for music. It was like a New York City phone book. It was enormous, and it listed all the records in print in America at that moment. So I went to the lady at the candy store and I said, I want a record by Thelonious Monk. So she looked up Thelonious Monk and she ordered me one. Uh, even then you could get information. Um, then I got to college and there was a guy who was really knowledgeable, and he had the jazz show on Sunday nights on the radio station, and I would go and sit and study, listen to him, and hang out and ask him questions, because there weren't that many books then, and certainly there was no, pardon me, no internet. So now
Mhm.
you have the advantage of Google, and you can find out just about everything this side of I don't know what I mean, but certainly jazz. Um, I don't know if it's true that young people these days um, don't read. Many of them don't read so
They do
much,
not. They
and
do
and
not.
reading has fallen out of favor, which is a tragedy. It is. I find it interesting. I'm a weird old man who, for instance, um, you know, sorry, I don't mean to insult you.
Please.
I do all these interviews for podcasts, which I don't listen to because I think that reading is a much faster way of absorbing information than listening to it on a podcast or audio book. I don't
Totally.
disrespect the
Totally.
way you can learn that way. It doesn't suit me. And the fact is that there's this whole span of culture, of history, of whatever, um, that that you know I only learn slowly, um, as I say, from listening to a guy and then listening to a whole lot of records until now I have a fair grasp of the history of jazz. but I've been doing it for a whole lot of years. It's a very complex phenomenon, and I'm glad you found it. But there's it's just never going to stop. I mean, if you keep your mind open and alive, open to curiosity, you will run across things like this till the day you die.
Yeah, yeah, I hope to. I hope to, because I find that a lot of this is odd and fun and super super just relatable because I think that there's something that I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm observant, and there's a Jewish writer from the 1800s, and one of the things that he loves to talk about is the fact that you know times change, but human nature kind of stays the same. And a lot
Much.
of and a lot of the a lot of these issues that that I'm learning about are these forms of self-expression or history or what caused what caused an emergence of culture. All that is extremely relatable. I'm reading what's it called book, that book by Danny Sugarman now about being the Doors manager, and
Jack
I'm reading
Holzman.
it now and I'm like, yes. I think it's called Wonderland. What's it called? Wonderland, I think.
I forget the
But
name. I just ran across Danny. As a matter of fact, he was very kind about my book. Let me tell you that. Please don't think that I'm talking down, but
please.
you really want to read the on Highway 61 because it will give you uh, the history of black music. And I mean, it's not a history of black music. It's a history of white reaction to black music, but it'll give you a good handle on jazz history if that's something, as you say, that concerns you. Um, it's and the way white people glommed onto it and why.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. Okay, I'm going to. Can you
I mean,
can you, why
it's
don't you
most.
can you elaborate on the difference in the blues and jazz culture?
Oh well. Um, on the whole, well, again, that's a 6 hour lecture. The Just put it this way: you get to the 1890s, black people have been freed from slavery for 40 years. Essentially one large generation,
Hmm.
and within a few years, three phenomena, um, uh, musical phenomena, emerge all at the same time, not in the same place. One is the blues, which started coming together in the 1890s. Um, One is jazz, which started then and combined blues with in New Orleans, and the reason it was New Orleans, among other things, was that the French military, uh, remember it was French, the city, had left behind a whole lot of musical instruments, so that
Mm.
the black people of New Orleans had access to and were exposed to these instruments, and started taking blues changes and applying them to popular music, and gave birth to jazz. And then,
Wow.
thirdly, at the same time in New Orleans, a man named Scott Joplin was marrying blues changes and African American sounds to um, classical music, Western classical, and that became ragtime, and
Wow.
changed the it's called syncopation, in which you have more than one rhythm going at the same time, and they 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 measure against each other, um, and these three things each um, develop over the course of the 20th century. And by the time you get to the 1940s, the blues has now traveled along with the migration of black people to Chicago,
Hmm.
where it's in a situation that literally needs more volume. So they start playing with electric instruments, and it becomes what is called Chicago blues, the electric blues. At the same
Mm-hmm.
time, uh, it also encounters certain country rhythms, and it becomes what they call rhythm and blues, and eventually that becomes rock and roll. And then white people go back and look at the R&B. The same guy, the same producer who produced Louis Jordan, who was the fundamental king of R&B in the 40s. The same guy, a guy named Milt Gabler, then turned around and produced, oh God, I've forgotten his name. Oh my Lord, I'm pulling a blank.
As soon
Um,
as you stop thinking about it, it'll pop back into your head.
yeah, no doubt, no doubt. It was the Comet. Bill Haley. Bill Haley and the Comets, who were started doing um, rhythm and blues songs, but in a countryish sort of. He had been a country band. It was they were Bill Haley and the Saddlemen first. Then he started listening to R&B and went and they became the Comets, and
Hmm.
and then
That
you've
was
got
Rock Around the Clock, right?
Rock Around the Clock, exactly, which of course was originally a black song. So,
Yeah.
um, and all of the all of this is about, and if you really want to take it seriously, you can go back to the 1740s and what was called the great, not transformation. What am I? Again, I'm pulling a blank. Um, the Great Awakening, in which there was an enormous series of religious revivals all over the what was then colonial United States. The United States only had 13 colonies at that point, um, and maybe a few more, but still, it was early days. And but what happened was, in the South in particular, the revival allowed for black people, but they had to sit in the balcony. They were segregated, but they were part of it, and you could hear them. And what happened was that black choral singing affected
Mm,
church music as early as the
sure.
1750s. And so that you can't talk about black music or white music after that. It's all both.
Yeah.
And there was a guy named Cecil Sharp who was a very good musicologist in England. What they call child ballads, the old sort of classic English folk songs. And then he came to America and he sort of he studied them in America and decided that, well, there was this white music, Appalachians, that had that was pure and that was English, and then there was black music using the same material, which was
Hmm.
to him commercial and not to be trusted. Now the fact is that the patron saint of folk music of Appalachian music was the Carter. The saints were the Carter family, and the elder of the Carter family literally did collect songs, um, and he collected them with a black guy. In other words, they were collecting blues and folk songs just as much as "Will the Circle Be Unbroken," um,
Hmm.
and so the fact is that all of this stuff works together, has always worked together. Uh, the most important, and again, this is a book you should read. And I forget the name, but it's a biography of Harry Smith, and it's Harry Smith collected, among other things, collected 78s, and then quite illegally, he and Mo Ash at Folkways. They never got permissions. I mean, it could never happen today. But they put out one of the first box sets, a 6 LP, 33 and a third collection of American folk music, what he called folk music. It wasn't folk music, it was commercial music. It was music professionally recorded between 1929, when electronic microphones became available, against acoustic
Hmm.
microphones, which were really crude. Um, and and uh, he put together this package, they were all recorded between 1929 and 1932, when, because of the Depression, the recording industry just went completely belly up, and for several years they just didn't sell anything. And these songs, he does not, and I'm very proud of him. He does not identify people as black or white, and you can't tell. These
Right.
southern, it's a southern accent, so it could, you don't know. Um, and This music, which was called the uh, folk, let's see, the folk music anthology, um, uh, ended up being the source for that old music that Dylan and all the other folkies in the early '60s um,
Right.
pursued.
Didn't drug music have a big impact too?
Jug music is part of all this. It had its biggest impact actually in England, where it was called skiffle. Long story and too complex to explain that, but trust me. And Skiffle, which led to English rock and roll. I mean, John
Right.
Lennon and Paul McCartney had a skiffle band called the Quarrymen. There you go.
Yeah. Who was that? There was, yeah, there was so all this. Okay, I love your answers because they take me on a whole nother trip. Every single time, every single
Well,
time.
you're
Um,
bouncing around in subjects, so I'm responding.
I'm loving it. This is fun. No, no,
I
no.
mean,
I'm having
this is what I've been wasting my time with for the last 50 years, you know? What can I say?
doing these interviews.
No, 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 no.
Oh, this
Studying
kind
all
of
this stuff.
research. I love it. I love it, and I have to
So did
say,
I.
your recall is incredible. Your recall is incredible. Can you tell me a little bit about spending time with what is it? What was it like being a publicist? What was it like? Can you tell me some stories about working with them and dealing with them? Were they as difficult as everyone says they were? Was it fun? What was it like?
It was mostly fun. Um, it had the only problem. Um, no, it was the ideal situation in many ways because, for instance, they were the only band in history that didn't give a shit about whether or not they got publicity or not. Okay? They lived in
So
their
it's an
own
easy
world.
job.
And on that level, it was an easy job. It really was. Um, when I thought it was worthwhile, eventually I learned that when I thought it was worthwhile, Jerry trusted me. He hired me. He trusted me, and he did most. He was the target of most of the requests, and he did most of the interviews. There were band members that just didn't do interviews, which fine with me. You don't want to talk, don't talk. Um, what happened was that when I became the publicist in 1984. At which point I was in my mid 30s, and there were generations of deadheads, right? So the first generation were the people in San Francisco in the 60s, and the second generation were college kids on the East Coast between DC, Boston, and Chicago, within that triangle, where the Grateful Dead started playing colleges in the late 60s. Um, well, by the middle 80s, these are people like me in their mid 30s, and some of them are newspaper editors, and some of them are TV executives, and they want to cover the Grateful Dead. They want to cover it positively. But as I pointed out to the band, if that you don't let them in, and you can't trust the venue to do it, this is a job. The Grateful Dead always, went for a self-contained uh, setup. So you had to use promoters, but you trained them and you kept them even when you found out they were stealing from you. We never changed them.
Oh yeah.
Like, okay, bad boy, make sure that the catering's right, etc. Uh, and so I said, look, here's the deal. These TV crews are going to come to the show. Your story now, suddenly Cincinnati erupts in tie dye. You know that people. It's a story, and you know. So they're going to want to cover the show. If they can, they'll shoot the beginning of the show, and it's pretty lights and pretty music, and they'll run that. Oh, the Grateful Dead are in town. Isn't this nice? If you don't let them in to shoot the music, they will shoot people smoking dope in the parking lot because they have,
Yeah.
when you send out that camera, it's got to come back with footage. Simple. Um, and everybody and the band went, yeah, you're right. So as far as that goes, mostly, what I did was answer the telephone, and make sure that reviewers could get in, and also deal with the photographers, still and video, uh, mostly to make it as invisible as possible. So they'd come in, they'd shoot, and they'd leave, um, and they
Hmm.
would attract the notice of the band and, more importantly, the crew, because the crew was extremely entitled and very indulged, and if they felt like picking on somebody, they did. That included me at times, but anyway. So, that was the job of being the publicist for the Grateful Dead. Other than that, um, I was sort of informally put in charge of special outings, so that, for instance, we went to the White House, and I had to, or we went to visit the vice president at his residence, and I'm explaining because, of course, the band, and I had gone, give me your social. We need the social security number to give to the Secret Service, and
Hmm.
blah 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 blah. And then I
Wow, what
get
was
in.
that like?
They were, the
Can you give me
Secret
like
Service was.
details about? Yeah.
They were professional. I mean, and we worked together. It was no problem. They were so professional that when we went to uh, to the Naval Observatory, which is the home of the vice president, and uh, we get into the van, and I discover that Mickey Hart's wife is Carol, and Mickey and Carol's nanny, who's a Latina lady, um, um, they didn't mention to me that she was coming. Thanks, guys. So I get out of the van at the door, at the gate, and I say, so here's, that's who that is, and blah blah blah, and here's the social security numbers. And that lady is a nanny, and quite frankly, I don't have her social security number. I don't even know if she has one, and I don't even know if she has papers. I think we can confidently say that she's of no possible danger to the vice president. But that's all I can say. And they just all, they recognize that famous people do things their own way sometimes, and they didn't give me a hard time, thank God. And we had an interesting time. And I'll tell you a funny story. So we're in there,
Please.
and we gather in the dining room, and it's just they had things to say to him, and he had things to say to them. It was very charming. And I went to the bathroom and smelled a familiar odor in the bathroom. And later that day, I looked at Jerry. I just sort of raised my eye and said, so I was in the bathroom when he said, man, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to smoke
Oh
dope
my
at the vice
God.
president's house. So, I couldn't. Um, and,
I hear.
um, the other, there was like one time we were at the White House, and no, I'll tell you a better story. So, Pat Leahy, who was a senator from Vermont, and became our good buddy, um, he looked like a senator, distinguished as all get out, until he put on a tie-dye t-shirt and shorts, and he's dancing on stage to the Grateful Dead. And I'm just thinking, frankly, that I'll tell you two stories. That I want to be in a country where senators dance in tie-dye t-shirts at Grateful Dead shows. This is
I
good.
agree.
So,
Yes.
Pat and Barbara Boxer, who was she was from Marin County, where the band was from, and we knew her a little bit, and they invite us to lunch at the Senate dining room, um, and we go, chore, and we sit down, and of course there's a buzz in the room when Jerry walks in because people recognize him, And far across the room is Strom Thurmond, the senator from the 19th century. I mean, this is a guy who led the Dixiecrats in 1948 and just a barbarian. But, senators, politicians, uh, love meeting celebrities because there's always a possibility they can get something out of them. Like
Hmm.
musicians, oh, will you do a benefit for me? So, and in fact, Mickey did with Nancy Pelosi. They're still actually good buddies. Um, uh,
Wow.
and Strom Thurmond had been eating first, and I can see him lean over when we came in. I saw him lean over to one of his younger staffers, saying, "Who, basically, who's that?" And the guy explains. So as he comes out, he comes over to our table, and everybody's polite and standing up because you're polite. And Strom goes to Jerry and sticks out his hand and says, "I understand you're the leader of this here organization." And Jerry's going, "Well, I don't know about that, Senator," but he's polite and he shakes his hand and they go on. And I'm just sitting there thinking, there's Jerry from the 21st century and Strom Thurmond from the 19th century, and they meet in the Senate dining room. It was just utterly bizarre. Here's another
Yeah.
one that's just as bizarre. So Pat Leahy's dancing on stage, and I happen to be standing next to the stage stairs, and a runner comes down from the office of the stadium. This is in D.C. and says, "Is Senator Leahy here?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, there's a message for him." I said, "Fine, I'll take it." And I give it to him. He says, "Do you have a phone?" And I said, "Oh, sure." By then, no cell phones, but by then, literally, we had a phone hardwired onto our stage
Hmm.
because we had to have it. So I go up to our stage manager and say, "Could the senator use your phone?" He says, "Sure." So he calls what turns out to be the Secretary of State. And it turns out that this is now President Clinton. President Clinton has just decided to bomb, I think it was Libya, but whatever it was, you know, and
Hmm.
he had to tell by custom, something Trump doesn't do. By custom, you tell. I think they call it the Gang of Eight, which is the speaker and the head of the intelligence committee of both, or
Right.
of both houses. What you've done. You don't have to ask for permission, but you have to tell them. So I'm standing there, and what I hear is Patrick saying, um, uh, well, the conversation, and he filled me in on the other end. The conversation goes, after a while, the Secretary of State says, "It's really loud there." And Pat said, "Yeah, that's Sting. He's the opening act. I'm at this concert." Um, and Sting, who's Sting? Who's the Grateful Dead? The Secretary of State has no clue. But finally he says, Do you have a minute for the president?" Yes. So the president gets up and tells him, and obviously the president is is a little hipper and a little more knowledgeable about music. Anyway, uh, they hang up, and Pat turns to me and tells me all this, and I'm standing there and I'm thinking, right now there's people at the CIA, obviously, and there's people in the Pentagon, that know about all this. But very few. Not now in half an hour, everybody's going to know about this. They'll make an announcement. But at the moment,
Sure.
I'm one of 100 people, and I'm stoned, and it's like, what? And that's working. Now that is an example of what it was like working for the Grateful Dead.
We call that a glitch in the matrix. When
Oh,
something's so bizarre.
The Matrix was permanently glitched around the Grateful Dead. We called it
Yes.
synchronicity. Things happened that had no business happening, and that was what life was
What
like.
was the fire in the mountain and the volcano erupting around the same time incident? That was in the
It
78 or around then?
it was in 1980.
Close.
It's true. The Grateful Dead were playing in Portland, Oregon, They started playing Fire on the Mountain, and in the middle of Fire, God's Truth, in the middle of Fire on the Mountain, Mount St. Helens erupted. Um, and, uh,
Yeah, it's crazy.
there's no explanation
It's
for that.
crazy.
And, correlation is
It's
not
crazy.
causation, but it was this very strange moment.
No, no, but it's weird. Yeah,
It's a weird. You have to understand that weird was a very positive adjective in the world of the
sure,
Grateful Dead.
sure.
We
Yeah, I
were
think weird is
weird. We
great.
knew we were weird.
Can I ask? And I guess this will be one of our last questions before we wrap up. What, in your opinion, kind of did Jerry in? I know that you said. I know that you. There's a couple of avenues you take in the book. Maybe it's stardom. Maybe it was all the pressure. Maybe obviously heroin was not great. By any stretch
But
of the
remember,
imagination.
no,
Um,
let's be
he
clear
didn't like
about
to
this.
be like a superstar.
He did not want to be a superstar. He wanted to have fun. Um, uh, the heroin probably kept him going. Before you label that, it was a sedative that kept him coping. The fact is that he died of a heart attack because he didn't take care of himself. I mean, all of the things that every guy over 40 learns, you have to watch your weight, you have to exercise a little, you have blah blah blah. And he never quit smoking cigarettes, and and he was a raging diabetic, and that led to a heart attack. And he didn't want to take responsibility. And you could do a very deep psychoanalysis that I am not qualified to do. Um, I think one of the obvious things is, uh, being treated as special when he didn't, really want to be. And
Hmm.
I'll tell you one story. Well, let's close on one story.
Please.
I was sitting in the lobby of one of I think it's the Marriott's, but whatever. It's a hotel with a glass elevator on the inside, so you can see who's in the elevator. I was on the floor of the lobby, and the lobby came up from the basement where the gym was, and it stopped at our level, and I could see Jerry, and he was alone in the elevator, and I could watch him tense as the doors opened because he was assuming that there were going to be a gaggle of deadheads and they were going, oh,
Hmm.
Jerry. And it turned out to be my wife, who was an old friend of his, and so I could watch him relax. It was quite a transition. She gets in, they're chatting or not, it didn't, and they go up to another floor, and same tents,
Hmm.
and the door opens, and there's three Latina maids who don't know him, don't care, and uh, you know, and then the point being that it was hard. He couldn't go to museums. The nicest thing I ever did for the Grateful Dead was I arranged an hour alone with this major Monet exhibit, traveling exhibit in Chicago, and they had, I mean, Jerry in particular. I mean, he loved this art, and he couldn't go to the Field Museum. I mean, the museum, the Art Institute. I mean, he'd be glommed onto.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
that it's deeper stuff than just fame, but fame certainly didn't help.
I bet. I bet. Dennis, I am so grateful for your time, and I'm so grateful that you got back to me, and I'm even more grateful for your work. I think your work is. I mean, I know that every single time I talk to a dead, anyone that knows anything about the Grateful Dead, I mention your name, I mention your book. It's the Bible for that community. So aside from the other great and the other great work that you've done, and as you dive into, I just want to say I really appreciate everything you've done. This is incredible, and this is such a. I have not been more excited to do a podcast with any guest more than I was excited for today, and I really really appreciate your time, Dennis. Thank you
Well,
so much.
you're entirely welcome. I hope I made it worthwhile. You take care.
Definitely. All the
All right.
best. Take care. Bye bye.
Peace. Bye bye.